The sky was heavy with clouds that afternoon, and the rain poured over the quiet town of Ashbrook. Margaret stood behind the counter of her small cafe, Willow's Corner, wiping mugs and pretending to focus on work. But her eyes kept drifting toward the boy sitting by the window. He'd been coming in every day for almost a week now, always at the same time, always at the same table, the one closest to the street, where he could watch the rain slide down the glass. He couldn't have been older than 16 or 17. His name, she'd learned from the receipt, was Ethan. Every day, he ordered the same thing, a hot chocolate and a blueberry muffin. He spoke little, smiled politely, and stayed for hours. There was something quiet and familiar about him that Margaret couldn't quite name. His posture, his voice, the way he looked at people, it stirred something deep inside her, something she didn't want to examine too closely. Her cafe was usually filled with the easy hum of conversation, friends meeting after work, students studying, couples sharing quiet moments. But when Ethan was there, everything felt still, like time slowed for him. Sometimes she caught him staring at an old framed photo on the counter, her and her late husband, Thomas, laughing under the summer sun. The boy's expression when he looked at it was hard to describe. Not curiosity exactly, but something gentler, almost sorrowful. On the fourth day, as the clock neared closing time, she decided to speak to him. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to his table. "You must really like the rain," she said with a small smile. He looked up, startled at first, then returned the smile. "It's peaceful," he said softly. "Makes everything else feel quiet." "I've always thought that too," Margaret replied. "Most people complain about it. I find it comforting," he nodded. "You've had this cafe for a while, haven't you?" She tilted her head. "About 10 years now." "Why?" He shrugged. "It feels familiar, like I've seen it before." Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe you have. It hasn't changed much." His eyes shifted toward the framed photo again. "Is that your husband?" he asked quietly. Her hand paused midair. She followed his gaze and nodded. "Yes, that was Thomas. He passed away 12 years ago." The boy's expression flickered, something between surprise and recognition. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "He looks kind." "He was," she said, her voice lowering. "The kind of man who could fix anything except a broken heart." Ethan hesitated, then said, I might have known him." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He looked down at his hands, fidgeting. "I shouldn't say this here," he whispered. "But I think I'm his son." The room went quiet. The sound of rain outside seemed to fade. Margaret felt her breath catch as if someone had pulled the floor from beneath her feet. She studied his face, his features, his voice, his eyes, and suddenly she saw it. The same eyes as Thomas. The same way of sitting slightly slouched, lost in thought. She stepped back, her pulse racing. "That's not possible," she said weakly. "Thomas and I know," he interrupted quickly, guilt filling his voice. "I know he was married to you. My mom told me. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just needed to see you, to understand." Margaret's heart pounded. "Understand what?" "What kind of man he was," Ethan said. "What kind of life he lived here. I didn't know about him until recently. My mom told me the truth last month." Margaret gripped the edge of a chair to steady herself. "The truth?" Ethan nodded. "She told me his name, Thomas Reed. She said he helped her once, a long time ago. That they were close for a short while before he left. She said he didn't know about me right away, but later he tried to help. He wrote letters. He wanted to meet me, but she wouldn't let him. She didn't want to ruin your life." Margaret's world tilted. The name Thomas Reed had always meant loyalty, love, and stability to her. She couldn't picture him living another life even briefly, yet the evidence was sitting right in front of her, with Thomas's eyes and voice and smile. Her voice broke slightly. "Why come here now?" Ethan's answer was simple. "Because he told me to. In a letter he wrote years ago. I found it last month in my mom's attic. He said, 'If you ever want to know who I truly was, go to Willow Street. There you'll find the person who knew my heart best.'" Margaret's throat tightened. The letter sounded exactly like something Thomas would write. Half poetic, half heartbreaking. Her hand trembled as she brushed a tear away. "And you came all this way? Just to see me?" He nodded. "I didn't know what I'd find. I just thought, if you loved him, maybe you could help me understand him, because I never got the chance. Margaret sat down slowly, feeling a mix of pain and something she couldn't quite name. The boy's presence stirred both old wounds and long-buried tenderness. You must have questions, she said quietly. Ethan's eyes met hers. Only one, he said. Was he a good man? Her heart clenched. She looked at the photo again, their smiles frozen in a moment untouched by time. Yes, she whispered. He was a good man. Not perfect, but good. He cared deeply, even when he didn't know how to show it. Ethan smiled sadly. That sounds like the man she described. Margaret studied him for a long time. You look like him, she said finally. The eyes especially. He smiled faintly. That's what my mom said too. The cafe grew quiet again, the only sound the soft tapping of rain against the glass. Margaret realized her shift had ended an hour ago, but she didn't move. Something about this moment felt too important to interrupt. Finally, she spoke. Ethan, I think you should come back tomorrow. There are things you need to know about him, about us, and maybe about yourself. He nodded slowly, relief in his eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Reed. I didn't expect you to even talk to me. Margaret managed a small smile. If Thomas trusted you enough to send you here, then I owe him that much. When Ethan left, she stood by the window, watching him disappear into the rain. Her reflection stared back at her, older, wiser, but suddenly filled with questions she thought were buried with her husband's ashes. Had Thomas ever tried to tell her? Had he left clues she ignored? And most painfully of all, if he'd kept this secret to protect her, did that mean he had truly loved her more than she ever realized? The rain outside grew softer, almost like a whisper against the glass. Margaret turned the closed sign on the cafe door and exhaled deeply. The day had started like any other, but now her life had changed forever. The boy who sat in her cafe wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was a living piece of a love she thought had ended years ago. A reminder that some secrets, no matter how painful, come to light when the heart is ready to face them. And for the first time in 12 years, Margaret felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not grief, not anger, but the faint, trembling spark of hope. The next morning came quietly, the kind of calm that follows a sleepless night. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in her hands. The storm from the day before had passed, but inside her, everything still felt unsettled. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, his eyes, his voice, his claim that Thomas had been his father. It didn't feel real, yet the ache in her chest told her it was. At exactly 10 o'clock, the bell above the cafe door chimed. Margaret looked up and saw him standing there again. The same shy expression, the same cautious energy. He'd come back just as he promised. She gave a faint smile and gestured for him to sit at the same table. I made you something different today, she said softly, placing a warm cinnamon roll in front of him. You look like you could use it, Ethan smiled. Thank you. I didn't sleep much. Neither did I, she admitted. Then, after a pause, she added, I keep wondering what Thomas would say if he knew you were here. Ethan looked down at his plate. I think he'd be glad. I think he wanted this. Margaret nodded slowly. You said you found a letter? He reached into his backpack and carefully pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. This one, he said, placing it gently on the table. It's old. My mom said she never meant to hide it forever. She just didn't know what to do with it back then. Margaret hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas's neat, slightly slanted script. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. To the son I never met, it began. If life allows, I hope you'll read this one day. I want you to know that your existence never ruined anything. You were not a mistake. You were a piece of my story I never got to hold. I made choices I thought would protect everyone. But not a day goes by that I don't think of what could have been. If you ever find your way to Willow Street, tell Margaret I still love her, and that I hope she forgave me long before she knew what for. By the time she reached the last line, Margaret's eyes were glistening. Her breath came unevenly as she folded the letter back with care. He wrote this, she whispered, her voice trembling. He really wrote this, Ethan nodded. It was hidden with old pictures of him. My mom said she couldn't destroy it. She knew it wasn't just meant for me. Margaret pressed the letter against her chest, as if holding it close could bring Thomas back. She remembered how he used to sit by the fireplace, pen in hand, writing notes and tucking them into books or drawers. Words he never showed her, but always said were, for later. She thought it was just a habit. Now, she realized it was his way of leaving pieces of himself behind. I don't know how to feel, she admitted quietly. I loved him, and I trusted him completely. But this, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Ethan spoke gently. I didn't come here to hurt you. I just wanted to know the truth. He wasn't perfect. My mom said that too. But she also said he cared about you more than anyone. That's why he stayed away. Margaret looked up sharply. Stayed away? She told me he wanted to tell you, Ethan said. But she stopped him. She said it would destroy your marriage. He argued with her once. She said it broke him. He came back home after that, but she said something in him changed. Margaret could picture it vividly. Thomas coming home quiet, withdrawn, saying he was just tired. She thought it was work. She never guessed it was guilt. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street. He must have carried this secret all those years, she said softly. And I never saw it. I never asked why he seemed so far away sometimes. Ethan joined her, standing a respectful distance away. Sometimes we think we know the people we love, he said. But everyone has parts they hide, not because they want to lie, but because they don't want to hurt us. Margaret turned to him, her eyes warm with tears. You sound like him when you say things like that. He smiled faintly. That's what my mom said too. That I think too much, talk too little. For a moment they both laughed softly. The first real laugh since he walked into her life. It felt fragile, but healing. Margaret gestured for him to sit again. Tell me about your mother, she said gently. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Her name's Claire. She met Thomas when she worked at a small bookstore outside Boston. She said he used to come in every week just to talk about novels. They became friends. One summer, he helped her move apartments, and I guess that's when things got complicated. He told her he was married, but he said his marriage was built on friendship, not fire. She didn't expect anything more, but life doesn't always listen. Margaret listened in silence. It hurt, but she didn't stop him. She needed to know, even if it broke her heart. When she found out she was pregnant, Ethan continued, she wrote to him, but he was overseas on a business trip. By the time he came back, she'd already decided to raise me alone. She said she couldn't be the reason you lost him. Margaret's throat tightened. That sounds like something Thomas would have respected. He always believed love meant protecting others, even from the truth. They sat quietly for a while, letting the weight of the past settle around them. Then Ethan asked softly, did he ever talk about regret? She thought for a long moment before answering. He used to say, we all have shadows, but love teaches us to walk toward the light anyway. I never understood what he meant until now. Ethan nodded. He was right. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with unspoken understanding. Two people, tied by one man's choices, sitting across from each other in a small cafe that suddenly felt sacred. After a while, Margaret looked up and said, would you like to see where he's buried? Ethan's eyes widened. You'd take me there? Of course, she said softly. If he were here, he'd want that. Ethan smiled, his voice quiet. Thank you, Mrs. Reed. That means more than you know. As they closed the cafe early and stepped out into the sunlight, Margaret felt something shift inside her. For years, her grief had been a locked room. Now, it felt like someone had opened the door just enough for the light to come through. When they reached the cemetery, Ethan stood before Thomas's headstone in silence. The grass around it was trimmed neatly, and a single rose lay across the stone. Margaret came here every week, always with a rose, the same kind Thomas used to tuck behind her ear. Ethan crouched down and traced the engraved name with his fingers. Hi, Dad, he whispered. I made it. Margaret's breath caught and tears filled her eyes. She didn't interrupt. She let him have that moment because it wasn't just his. It was hers too. When Ethan finally stood, he turned to her. "You know," he said quietly, "he didn't just leave love behind. He left a chance for it to keep growing, through people like us." She smiled through her tears. "Then maybe this isn't an ending after all," she said. "Maybe it's where everything finally begins." The wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, the same scent that had brought them together in the first place. And as they walked back toward the cafe, Margaret realized something she hadn't felt in years: peace. 2 days later, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time that week. The town of Ashbrook looked brighter, and so did Margaret's cafe. There was laughter again, a little life returning to the quiet place that had once held only memories. Ethan had been helping around the shop, cleaning tables, restocking pastries, learning to make coffee just the way Thomas liked it. Watching him work felt strange, not because he reminded her of Thomas, but because he was making the cafe feel alive in ways she hadn't expected. By late afternoon, when the last customer left, Margaret wiped the counter and said softly, "Ethan, can you lock up? I want to show you something." He looked up curiously. "Sure, what is it?" She smiled faintly. "Something your father left behind. Something I never had the courage to open." They walked across the street to her old house, the one she'd shared with Thomas for nearly 2 decades. It was a cozy wooden home with ivy climbing up one side and creaky steps that groaned under their weight. She hadn't let anyone inside for years except to clean, but today felt different. Today, she was ready. Margaret led him to the narrow staircase that went up to the attic. Dust floated in the afternoon light, and the smell of cedar and thyme hung in the air. When they reached the top, she pulled a chain, and a single bulb flickered on, revealing boxes, photo albums, and old furniture. "It's all here," she said quietly. "Everything he ever built, touched, or saved." Ethan looked around with awe. "It's like a museum of his life." She walked to a corner where an old chest sat, covered with a thin blanket. "This one," she said, brushing away the dust. "He told me once that it held things from before we met. I never opened it after he died. I didn't think I was strong enough." Ethan knelt beside her. "Do you want me to open it?" She nodded. Together. He unlatched the rusted clasp, and the lid creaked open. Inside lay a collection of keepsakes, letters, photographs, an old wristwatch, and a small wooden box with Thomas's initials carved into it. Margaret reached for the watch first. The moment she touched it, tears welled in her eyes. He wore this every day. Said it was his reminder that time doesn't wait for anyone. Ethan smiled faintly. "I found a picture of him wearing it in my mom's things." Margaret handed it to him. "Then it belongs to you now." He shook his head. "No, keep it. You were his heart." She hesitated, then nodded slowly, moved by his words. Then her eyes drifted to the small wooden box. "I've never seen this one before." Ethan leaned closer. "It has a keyhole. Maybe the key's inside the chest." They rummaged through the items until Ethan found a tiny brass key taped under an envelope. "Here," he said. Margaret turned the key carefully, and the lid clicked open. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The top one had her name written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Her voice trembled. "He wrote me letters he never sent." Ethan looked at her gently. "Maybe he wanted you to find them when you were ready." Margaret untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. Thomas's words flowed like whispers from the past. "My dearest Margaret, there are things I can't say aloud because words spoken fade too quickly. But on paper I can be honest. There's something I must tell you, not because I've stopped loving you, but because I love you too much to let lies grow between us." She stopped reading, her eyes glistening. "He must have written this when he found out about Ethan," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "It sounds like he wanted to confess but didn't know how." Margaret continued. "Years ago, before we met, there was someone who needed me. I helped her through a dark time. It wasn't meant to last. It wasn't love like ours. But something came of it, something I never expected. A child. I didn't know until long after. By then, it was too late to change what had been done. She chose silence, and I chose loyalty to you. But I never stopped thinking of the boy. I wanted to tell you. but I feared it would take from us what we built together. If you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to speak, and for that, I'm sorry." Margaret lowered the letter, her chest tightening with every breath. Ethan looked at her silently, waiting. "He carried this burden all those years," she murmured, "and I never knew. I thought his distance in those final months was just his health failing, but it was guilt." Ethan's voice was quiet. "He did love you. I can feel it in every word." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Yes, he did, and somehow knowing that makes it hurt a little less." They read through a few more letters, some addressed to her, others to no one in particular. In them, Thomas wrote about his dreams, his fears, and his hope that someday his two worlds might meet in peace. One line stood out above all others. "Love is not about perfection. It's about forgiveness that comes even when no one asks for it." Margaret folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the box. "He must have known this day would come," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Maybe that's why he kept everything here, waiting for you to find it." As they sat together, surrounded by the scent of old wood and faded ink, Margaret realized that something inside her had shifted. For years, she had lived in quiet grief, thinking her story with Thomas ended the day he died. But now she saw that love had simply changed form. It had passed on through letters, memories, and the boy sitting beside her. Ethan looked around the attic and spotted a small painting leaning against the wall. It was a landscape, a river at sunset, painted in soft strokes. "Did he paint this?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "Yes. He painted it the summer before he got sick. He said it reminded him of hope, how even when the sun sets, it leaves light behind." Ethan picked up the painting and studied it. "It's beautiful. He must have been thinking of you when he painted it." "Maybe," she said quietly. "Or maybe he was thinking of the life he wanted all of us to have, one filled with peace." As they climbed down from the attic, Margaret felt lighter, as if the truth had lifted the weight she'd carried for years. Ethan followed her, holding the box carefully. "What will you do with the letters?" he asked. She smiled. "Keep them here. They belong to both of us now. They're pieces of him, and of us." Outside, the air smelled of rain again, soft and clean. Margaret stood on the porch, watching Ethan as he looked up at the sky. "You know," she said gently, "you've given me something I didn't know I needed. Closure." He turned to her, his eyes kind. "And you gave me something I've never had. Family." The wind stirred the leaves, and the last bit of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over them both. Margaret looked toward the horizon, feeling Thomas's presence in the quiet air. Not as a ghost of regret, but as a whisper of peace. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a bridge, one built from love, truth, and forgiveness. The next morning, the world outside Margaret's house seemed softer, like the air itself understood something had changed. For the first time in years, she woke up without the heavy ache of loss. The letters had brought pain, yes, but they also gave her peace, the kind that comes from knowing the truth, even if it hurts. Ethan arrived early, carrying 2 cups of coffee from her cafe. "Thought I'd beat you to it this time," he said, setting one down in front of her with a shy grin. She laughed quietly. "You're getting good at this. It tastes just right," he smiled. "Guess I had a good teacher." They sat by the window in silence for a moment, watching the morning light touch the trees. The letters they'd found last night lay on the table between them, the ribbon now neatly retied. Margaret traced her fingers over the stack. "I think there's one more thing I didn't read," she said, noticing an envelope she hadn't opened before. It was smaller, sealed, and her name was written in a trembling hand. Thomas's last days, perhaps. Ethan looked at her carefully. "Do you want to read it alone?" She shook her head. "No, I think it's meant for both of us." Her hands trembled as she opened it. The paper inside was yellowed but intact. She unfolded it slowly, and Thomas's handwriting appeared again, uneven but full of warmth. My dear Margaret, if this letter reaches your hands, it means I've already gone. I hope by now you've forgiven me, not just for what I hid, but for the silence that followed. I always believed love was about keeping pain away, but I was wrong. Real love is about facing the truth together. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. And if one day the boy finds you, I pray you'll see him not as my mistake, but as my echo, a part of me left behind for you to love when I no longer can. Tell him he was never unwanted. He was always loved even from a distance. And tell yourself this: I never left you, not really. Love doesn't end when a heartbeat stops. It just changes where it lives. By the time she finished reading, Margaret's cheeks were wet with tears. She placed the letter on the table and pressed her palm against it. He knew this moment would come, she whispered. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. He wanted you to know I wasn't a shadow from his past. He wanted you to know I was meant to find you. She reached for his hand, gripping it gently. And I'm so glad you did. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, a bridge between what was lost and what had been found. Later that afternoon, Margaret locked the cafe early and invited Ethan to walk with her. The path led through the park, where she and Thomas used to go every Sunday, back when life was simpler. The leaves had turned shades of gold and amber, falling softly with the breeze. Ethan looked around. He used to bring me here when I was little. I didn't know it was the same park. Margaret smiled faintly. Then maybe he wanted our paths to cross again, without us knowing. They stopped at the wooden bench near the lake, the same one where Thomas had proposed years ago. The plaque was still there. To love always. Margaret touched it gently. He believed in love lasting forever, she said. Ethan nodded. I think he was right. In some way, it never really ends. They sat in silence, watching the sun dip lower. The sky reflected in the water, painting everything gold. For the first time, Margaret didn't feel alone sitting there. She turned to Ethan. What will you do now? Stay in town? He thought for a moment. Maybe for a while. I want to help out at the cafe if you'll let me, and maybe get to know the part of my father I never had. Her heart softened. You don't need my permission for that. Your family, Ethan. Always will be. He smiled, and there was something peaceful in his expression. A quiet sense of belonging. Over the next few weeks, the cafe changed in small, beautiful ways. Ethan added new ideas, small touches that brought life back into the place. He started hosting Memory Sundays, where locals came to share stories of loved ones they'd lost. People laughed, cried, and remembered together. It became more than a cafe. It became a place of healing. Margaret would often watch from behind the counter, smiling as Ethan spoke with customers, his easy charm reminding her so much of Thomas. Yet there was something uniquely his own, too. A warmth, a steadiness that seemed to fill the room. One evening, as they were closing, Ethan found Margaret sitting at a table, looking at the letters again. You still read them? He asked. She nodded. Sometimes. They remind me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. You know, I've been thinking about writing him back. She looked up. To your father? He smiled softly. Yeah. I know he can't read it, but maybe it's not for him. Maybe it's for me. Margaret placed a hand over his. Then you should. He'd want that. That night after Ethan left, she stayed behind in the quiet cafe. She opened her journal, something she hadn't done in years, and began to write her own letter. Thomas, I forgive you. For the silence, for the fear, for not telling me sooner, because love like ours deserves forgiveness. Ethan is kind, strong, and gentle. Everything you hoped he'd be. I see you in him every day, and I finally understand what you meant when you said love never dies. It just changes where it lives. It lives in him now, and in me. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it inside the wooden box with the others. It felt right. Like closing a chapter, not in sadness, but in peace. The next morning, Ethan found a small note waiting for him at the counter. It read, "The cafe is yours today. Run it your way." He smiled, unlocking the doors as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the street. Margaret watched from the window of her house. a quiet pride in her heart. For the first time since Thomas's passing, the future didn't feel like something to fear. Weeks turned into months, and the cafe became the heart of Ashbrook again. Tourists and locals alike came not just for coffee, but for comfort. People said there was something special in the air, warmth, kindness, connection. None of them knew the full story, but they felt it. One spring morning, Ethan placed a framed photo on the cafe wall. Thomas, standing by the lake, smiling at the camera. Beneath it, he added a simple line, "Love doesn't end. It continues in those who remember." When Margaret saw it, tears filled her eyes. But this time they weren't from pain. They were from gratitude. She placed her hand on the frame and whispered, "You were right, Thomas. Love really does find its way home." Outside, the bells on the cafe door jingled as new customers walked in. Laughter filled the room again, soft and alive. And in that moment, Margaret knew the story had come full circle, from secrets to truth, from grief to peace, from endings to new beginnings. Love hadn't vanished. It had simply changed where it lived.